there's a place you should know about. Not the Salem you might picture. Not the tourists with the black cats on their sweatshirts. Not the Halloween decorations strung up in October. Not the gift shops selling crystal balls and little witch figurines. No, the place I want to take you tonight is older than any of that. It's cold, it's dark, and it smells like wood smoke and wet earth. And something else, something harder to name. Fear, maybe. Or the particular kind of silence that settles over a community when it turns on itself. Tonight, if you're comfortable, if you found your blanket and your pillow and you're ready to let your mind drift somewhere old and honest and strange, I'd like to take you back to the winter of 1692, to a small village on the edge of a continent that Europeans were still learning how to survive. And I want to tell you the real story, not the story of witches and cauldrons and broomsticks, but the story of what happens when ordinary people, living ordinary lives, become extraordinary in the worst possible way. This is the story of what really happened during the Salem witch trials. And I think, if you listen carefully, you'll find it's more familiar than you expect. By the way, if someone told you about history to Unwind, or if you found us in some unexpected corner of the internet, we'd love to know. Drop us a comment. Tell us where you're listening from tonight. We read every one. Now, close your eyes if you'd like, or let them go soft and unfocused, and let's begin. Let me paint you a picture of Massachusetts in January 1692. There are no electric lights, so the darkness is complete and ancient when the sun goes down. The trees have been stripped of their leaves for months. Bare birches and oaks standing like gray skeletons against a pewter sky. The roads, such as they are just wide dirt paths frozen solid by now. The ground iron hard beneath your boots. When the wind comes in off the Atlantic, it doesn't merely chill you. It reaches through your coat and your shirt and settles somewhere in your chest. People in Salem Village in 1692 live close together and far apart at the same time. Close in the sense that their houses cluster along these frozen lanes, that they know each other by name and by reputation, and by the ongoing, complicated history of their families. Far apart in the sense that each household is an island, a self-contained world of candles and hearth fires and the low sounds of people sleeping. And outside, just beyond the light, is the forest. And beyond the forest, further still, are things that no one in Salem Village entirely understands. The frontier, the wilderness, the vast dark interior of a continent that still doesn't belong to anyone who looks like them. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The feeling of being on the edge of something. In the house of Reverend Samuel Paris, the minister of Salem Village's small congregational church, 2 children have been unwell for several weeks. His daughter, 9-year-old Betty Paris, and his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams, who lives with the family, have been behaving strangely. Some days they seem perfectly fine. On others, they fall into fits, writhing, screaming, throwing objects, complaining that invisible pins are being pushed into their skin. They bark like dogs. They babble nonsense. They contort their bodies in ways that frighten the adults around them. The local doctor, William Griggs, is called. He examines the girls. He considers every illness he knows of, and then he gives his diagnosis: bewitchment. Someone, he says, has done this to them. And so begins the question that will consume a community for the better part of a year. That will leave 19 people dead by hanging, and 1 man crushed beneath stones. That will send more than 200 people to jail and shatter the lives of hundreds more. Who did it? That question, so simple, so devastating, is where this story begins. But before we can follow it, we need to understand something that most people get wrong about Salem. Something so important that without it, the entire story becomes a ghost story when it's really something far more grounded. There were 2 Salems. This matters more than almost anything else. When people think about Salem in 1692, they tend to picture one place, one town, one community. But that's not quite right. There was Salem Town, and there was Salem Village. and the two were as different as any two places can be while still sharing a name. Salem town sat on the coast. It was a working port, a place of commerce, and salt air and merchant ships heavy with goods from England and the Caribbean. It was prosperous. Its residents were connected to trade routes, to the wider world, to the growing economy of the colonies. The families who thrived in Salem town were the kind who knew how to read contracts and navigate the complicated politics of colonial life. Salem Village was about 10 miles inland. It was smaller, poorer, more rural. Its residents were farmers, mostly, scratching their livings out of cold New England soil. They paid taxes to Salem town. They were administratively part of Salem town, and they resented it with the particular quiet intensity of people who have been told their whole lives that someone else knows better. For decades, before 1692, Salem Village had been trying to establish its own identity, its own church, its own autonomy, its own sense of being a real community rather than just a dependent appendage of a richer neighbor. And for decades, that project had been complicated by something that sounds almost too mundane to matter. Two families, the Putnams and the Porters. If you were mapping the fault lines of Salem Village in the years before the witch trials, you'd find these two families at the center of nearly every one. The Putnams were farmers of the old Puritan tradition, conservative, land-focused, deeply invested in the independence of the village from Salem town's commercial influence. They believed that the merchant culture creeping in from the coast was a corruption. They believed the village should run itself, and they believed they should be the ones running it. The Porters, on the other hand, had diversified. They developed commercial interests in Salem town and beyond, built sawmills and business connections, and their wealth had grown steadily, while the Putnam family wealth had stagnated. In 1672, a dam and sawmill run by the Porters flooded the Putnam farms. The resulting lawsuit didn't resolve anything. It just codified the hostility. And then, in 1689, through the influence of the Putnams, a man named Samuel Parris was appointed as the pastor of Salem Village's church. Parris was an unusual choice. He was originally from London, had spent time as a sugar merchant in Barbados, had tried and failed at commerce before finding his way to the pulpit. He was not a man of particularly easy personality. He was shrewd, insecure, prone to interpreting opposition as persecution, and almost immediately after his arrival in Salem Village, he began trying to renegotiate his contract, pushing for ownership of the parsonage and additional compensation that struck many villagers as excessive. By October 1691, the political situation had come to a head. A faction of Parris's opponents, largely allied with the Porter family, had taken control of the village committee and promptly voted against paying Parris's salary. So in January 1692, when Betty Parris and Abigail Williams began their fits, they weren't happening in a vacuum. They were happening in the home of a man whose position was under threat, in a village already divided into armed camps of mistrust and resentment. During a winter when the cold made everything feel more desperate and the darkness came very early and the forest pressed up close, a spark needed somewhere to go. It found its way. Now, before we go further into what happened, I want to pause here and do something important. I want to explain why the people of Salem Village actually believe this was real, because this is the part that gets lost when we tell this story from the comfortable distance of 300 years. We look back and we think, how could they have believed such things? How could educated adults, ministers, judges, landowners, accept the idea that invisible spirits were attacking their neighbors? How could a community fall apart over something that sounds, to modern ears, almost comically implausible? And the answer is because they were Puritans. And being a Puritan in 1692 was not like being a modern person with a strong religious faith. It was something more total, more immersive, more structurally integrated into how you understood the entire world. For Puritan New England, the devil was not a metaphor. He was a being as real and present as the minister in the pulpit, the frost on the window glass, The neighbor knocking at the door. The Puritan theological tradition held that God and Satan were engaged in an ongoing, cosmic struggle over the souls of humanity, and that this struggle played out not in some distant spiritual realm, but right here, in the fields and households and daily lives of ordinary people. Every misfortune had a spiritual dimension. When the crops failed, it was a sign of God's displeasure or the devil's meddling. When a child died, and children died often, in colonial New England, from diseases that had no cure and conditions that would today be minor inconveniences. It was evidence of something larger, something that demanded interpretation. When a person behaved strangely or suffered unexplained illness, the question wasn't just medical, it was theological. During a winter, when the cold made everything feel more desperate, and the darkness came very early, and the forest pressed up close, a spark needed somewhere to go. It found its way. Now, before we go further into what happened, I want to pause here and do something important. I want to explain why the people of Salem Village actually believe this was real. Because this is the part that gets lost when we tell this story from the comfortable distance of 300 years. We look back and we think, how could they have believed such things? How could educated adults, ministers, judges, landowners, accept the idea that invisible spirits were attacking their neighbors? How could a community fall apart over something that sounds, to modern ears, almost comically implausible? And the answer is because they were Puritans. And being a Puritan in 1692 was not like being a modern person with a strong religious faith. It was something more total, more immersive, more structurally integrated into how you understood the entire world. For Puritan New England, the devil was not a metaphor. He was a being as real and present as the minister in the pulpit, the frost on the window glass, the neighbor knocking at the door. The Puritan theological tradition held that God and Satan were engaged in an ongoing, cosmic struggle over the souls of humanity, and that this struggle played out not in some distant spiritual realm, but right here, in the fields and households and daily lives of ordinary people. Every misfortune had a spiritual dimension. When the crops failed, it was a sign of God's displeasure or the devil's meddling. When a child died, and children died often, in colonial New England, from diseases that had no cure and conditions that would today be minor inconveniences. It was evidence of something larger, something that demanded interpretation. When a person behaved strangely or suffered unexplained illness, the question wasn't just medical, it was theological. It was. What does this mean? The Puritans had been through a great deal. In the decade before 1692, they had survived smallpox epidemics. They had lived through King Philip's War, a brutal conflict with Native American tribes that had devastated towns throughout New England and left survivors with a particular kind of trauma. The sense that violence could erupt anywhere, that safety was an illusion, that enemies were everywhere. In 1684, the English crown had revoked the Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter, thrown the legal and political structure of their world into chaos. By 1692, a new charter had only recently arrived, and the colony was still figuring out what it meant. People who have lived through that much uncertainty develop a particular relationship with fear. And crucially, for the Puritans, the supernatural wasn't a separate category of experience from the natural. Dreams were messages. Coincidences were signs. The visible and invisible worlds were not sealed off from each other. They interpenetrated, constantly, in ways that required careful attention. A minister like Samuel Sewall had been preaching for years about the devil's active presence in the world, about the struggle between good and evil that was never abstract, always immediate. So when the village doctor said bewitchment, nobody laughed. They believed him, and in believing him, they began a chain of events that would prove far harder to stop than it was to start. The question, once the doctor had spoken, was who? Abigail Williams and Betty Paris, the minister's daughter and niece, were pressed to name the source of their affliction. And the three names they eventually gave were instructive, not in what they revealed about witchcraft, but in what they revealed about social vulnerability. The first name was Tituba. Tituba was an enslaved woman in the Paris household, most likely of indigenous South American ancestry, originally from the Arawak communities of what is now Venezuela, brought to Barbados as a child and then purchased by Samuel Paris when she was a teenager. She had lived with the Paris family for over a decade. She cooked, cleaned, helped care for the children. She was present, constant, and utterly without power. When the accusations came, she had nowhere to go. The second name was Sarah Good. Sarah Good was 38 years old and visibly, publicly poor. Her father, a prosperous tavern owner, had committed suicide years earlier, leaving no will, and her family had been in financial decline ever since. By 1692, Good was effectively destitute. She went door to door begging, often muttering under her breath as she walked away from houses that turned her away, which her neighbors interpreted as cursing. She was pregnant. She rarely attended church. She was exactly the kind of person the community marks as an outsider. The third name was Sarah Osborne. Osborne was a woman who had caused quiet scandal by living openly with a man before marrying him, and who was embroiled in a legal dispute over her late husband's estate with members of the Putnam family. She hadn't attended church in more than 3 years. She was, in the eyes of her community, someone who didn't quite fit. 3 women, a slave, a beggar, a social outcast, and what happened there set the tone for everything that followed. Sarah Good denied everything. So did Sarah Osborne. Neither of them would confess to a crime they hadn't committed. And then came Tituba's examination. Tituba had been beaten by Samuel Paris for weeks. According to her own later account, he had kept it up until she confessed. Standing before the magistrates with no freedom, no legal protection, no advocate, and no reason to believe that telling the truth would save her, Tituba did what her situation demanded. She confessed. And she didn't confess to anything small. She told them the devil had come to her. He had shown her a book, she said, with names signed in it. And she had signed it too. She described the devil's companions, a tall man with white hair, strange animals, a yellow bird that perched near the magistrates. She said she had flown on sticks through the night. She named Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne as fellow witches. And then she said something that changed everything. She told them there were more witches in the community, many more. 9 signatures in the book, names she couldn't fully see. With that, the witch hunt had its explosive fuel. What had begun as a handful of sick children in a minister's house became, in an instant, evidence of a vast conspiracy. The devil wasn't just tormenting a few people. He had organized. He had recruited. He had infiltrators everywhere, in every household, walking down every lane. Tituba, who later recanted and said she had made everything up under the pressure of Paris's beatings, had just set fire to a building full of kindling. The affliction spread. More girls began showing symptoms: the fits, the screaming, the complaints of invisible torment. Ann Putnam Jr., 12 years old, and the daughter of Thomas Putnam, one of the most powerful Putnam family members, became afflicted. So did Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Hubbard, Mercy Lewis. The group of accusers grew, and as it grew, so did its power. And the accusations stopped being confined to society's obvious outsiders. In March, the name of Rebecca Nurse appeared. This was the moment the community realized something had changed. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old. She was a grandmother, a covenanted member of the church, which meant she had formally professed her faith and been accepted as a genuine Christian. And she was known throughout Salem Village as a woman of uncommon decency and piety. When she was told about the warrant for her arrest, she said quietly and with terrible dignity, "I am innocent as the child unborn, but surely, what sin hath God found out in me unrepented of, that he should lay such an affliction on me in my old age?" She was taken to jail in chains. 39 of her neighbors signed a petition attesting to her good character. It made no difference. If Rebecca Nurse could be a witch, then anyone could. And that was the point. Or at least, it was the effect. The accusing spread outward in concentric rings, growing more desperate and more chaotic as it went. The Putnams, who had feuded for years with the Nurse family over a land boundary dispute, were heavily involved in her prosecution. Thomas Putnam signed 10 legal complaints against defendants over the course of the trials and provided testimony against 24 accused. His daughter, Anne Jr., provided testimony against 48. 8 members of the Putnam family were involved in the prosecution of approximately 50 accused witches. This does not mean the trials were a simple Putnam conspiracy, manufactured entirely from personal grievance. The truth is more complicated and more troubling than that. The accusations drew on real fear, genuine terror, community fractures that ran deep. But it is impossible to ignore that the map of accusers and accused lines up almost exactly with the existing political geography of Salem Village. The Putnam faction, accusing. The Porter faction, accused. Scholars Paul Boyer and Stephen Nissenbaum, in their landmark 1974 book Salem Possessed, laid this pattern out in meticulous detail. The majority of accusers were Putnam supporters, while the majority of the accused had previously sided with the Porters. The hysteria was real, the fear was real, but it ran along channels that had been carved by years of feuding, land disputes, economic resentment, and political frustration. By April 1692, the jails were filling. It's important to understand what those jails were like, because this is another part of the story that gets softened in the telling. The Salem jail, located on Prison Lane, today's St. Peter Street, was a 2-story wooden building, about 20 feet square, designed for maximum security and minimum comfort. It had iron bars on the windows, shackles to chain prisoners to the walls, and a dirt floor. There was no air circulation to speak of. The sanitary conditions were deplorable. This was not a place where people waited in reasonable comfort for a fair trial. It was a place where people suffered. And they would charge for the suffering. If you were imprisoned on suspicion of witchcraft in 1692, you were expected to pay for your own confinement. When you were eventually released, if you were eventually released, you could not leave until you had settled your jail fees. Some of the accused had no money. Some spent months in chains simply because they couldn't afford to leave. Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good, was arrested in March. She was shackled in the dungeon. She was questioned by magistrates. Her terrified, barely coherent answers were taken as a confession. She spent 7 or 8 months imprisoned. Her father, William Good, later testified that she emerged from the experience with, in his words, little or no reason to govern herself, a child's mind broken by what had been done to it. William Good was issued £30 in compensation in 1711 for the death of his wife and the destruction of his daughter. It was not enough. It could not possibly be enough. The formal machinery of the trials began to take shape in the spring. Governor William Phips, newly arrived from England with the colony's new charter, needed to do something about the 200 or so accused witches filling up the jails. On May 27, 1692, he established a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which translates from its Norman French roots to hear and to decide. William Stoughton, the new lieutenant governor, was appointed as Chief Justice. Stoughton was a true believer, and the court he ran was built on a foundation of something that would, in retrospect, seem almost impossible to justify: spectral evidence. Here is what spectral evidence was, and why it mattered so much. The Puritan theological understanding held that Satan could project the spirits, the specters, of his agents into the world, and that these spirits could appear to victims and torment them while the witch's physical body remained elsewhere. So an accuser could testify in court that they had seen the specter of, say, Rebecca Nurse, that her spirit had appeared to them in a dream or vision and attacked them. And this was taken as evidence that Rebecca Nurse was in league with the devil. The logical difficulty of this, once you follow it to its conclusion, is obvious. How do you defend yourself against testimony about your own dream presence? How do you prove you weren't somewhere while you were, physically, somewhere else? You can't. There is no defense. Spectral evidence placed the accused in a position of absolute impossibility. The evidence against them was whatever anyone claimed to have seen in their own mind, at night, in their own sleep. It was dream testimony. It was vision testimony. It was the contents of someone else's imagination, entered into a court of law as proof of guilt. William Stoughton allowed this, over the objections of several of his colleagues. He found precedent in a 1662 English witchcraft trial presided over by the influential jurist, Sir Matthew Hale, whose published account of that case was cited as authorizing the use of spectral evidence in Salem. The new charter left a legal vacuum. There was uncertainty about which laws even applied. And into that vacuum, the court poured the evidence of dreams. The University of Chicago's legal scholars have noted that the Salem proceedings violated nearly every principle that would later become foundational to American law. There was no innocent until proven guilty. If you made it to trial, guilt was presumed. You had no right to legal counsel. The jury's verdict could be set aside by the judges, which actually happened in Rebecca Nurse's case, where the jury initially found her not guilty, and Stoughton sent them back to reconsider, and they returned with a guilty verdict. The distinction between hearsay and direct evidence collapsed entirely. There was another terrible asymmetry built into the process. If you confessed to being a witch, you lived. If you maintained your innocence, you died. This is not a paradox. It is a logical mechanism for generating confessions. 54 people confessed to being witches during the Salem trials. None of them were executed. The 19 people who were hanged are the ones who refused to say what the court demanded. They died for telling the truth. The first person executed was Bridget Bishop on June 10th, 1692. Bishop was, by the standards of Salem Village, an irregular character. She wore black clothing, unusual in a community where somber colors were the norm, but black was associated with transgression. She'd had a previous accusation of witchcraft against her, years earlier, which had been dismissed. She ran a tavern and was known for her lively personality, which sat uneasily with Puritan norms. 10 witnesses testified against her. She was convicted and taken to Proctor's Ledge, the rocky outcropping at the base of what the locals called Gallows Hill, about a half-mile from the center of town. The tree that served as the gallows is gone now. The neighborhood that grew up around it didn't know, for centuries, that it was standing on an execution site. It wasn't until 2016 that a team of scholars from the University of Virginia, using historical maps, geographic information systems, and eyewitness accounts preserved in the trial records, finally confirmed, beyond doubt, that Proctor's Ledge was the place. In 2017, the city of Salem dedicated a memorial there. A semicircular granite wall with 19 stones, each engraved with a name. On July 19th, 1692, 5 people were hanged: Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Before Sarah Good ascended the ladder, Reverend Nicholas Noyes urged her to confess and save her soul. She looked at him and said, "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take my life, God will give you blood to drink." 25 years later, Nicholas Noyes died of an internal hemorrhage. He choked on his own blood. The people of Salem remembered what Sarah Good had said. Rebecca Nurse's family recovered her body in secret that night. Because those convicted of witchcraft were not permitted proper Christian burial, their bodies thrown into the rocky crevice near the gallows, and brought her home under cover of darkness to bury her in the family land. It was an act of love, in defiance of a verdict that everyone in that household knew was wrong. On August 19th, 5 more were hanged: George Burroughs, Martha Carrier, George Jacob Sr., John Willard, and John Proctor. George Burroughs was remarkable, and his execution perhaps more than any other should have stopped the proceedings in their tracks. He was a minister, a former pastor of Salem Village, who had left under difficult circumstances and moved to Maine. He was accused of being the ringleader of the witch conspiracy, the one who held the witches' Sabbath and led them in their dark devotions. When he climbed to the gallows on August 19th, he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly. This was significant. It was widely believed that witches could not recite the Lord's Prayer without error, that Satan would not allow them to complete it. Burroughs completed it, word for word, without stumbling. The crowd watching went very quiet. Some of them wept. Several people in the audience began arguing that this man was innocent. Cotton Mather, the prominent Boston minister who had been a supporter of the trials, was there on horseback. He told the crowd that the devil often disguised himself as an angel of light and that Burroughs' flawless prayer proved nothing. The hangings proceeded. The night of September 19, 1692, in a field near the Salem jail, something happened that stands alone in the annals of this entire episode. Giles Corey, 81 years old, a farmer from the southeast end of Salem, had been arrested on suspicion of witchcraft. He had not helped his situation by having, earlier in the trials, testified against his own wife, Martha, though he later recanted and tried to defend her. It was too late. Martha was eventually hanged on September 22nd, but Giles, when brought before the court in September, refused to enter a plea. He refused to submit himself to the court's authority at all. He simply stood there and said nothing. Under English law, a defendant who refused to enter a plea could be subjected to peine forte et dure, which translates to strong and hard punishment. Stones were to be placed on his body, increasing in weight until he either agreed to plead or died. Giles Corey, 81 years old, chose to die. For 2 days, in that open field, stones were piled on his chest while the court demanded his plea. The sheriff, according to contemporary accounts, occasionally used his cane to push Corey's tongue back into his mouth when the pressure forced it out. Corey never spoke. His last reported words, some accounts say he said them during the second day, where more weighed. His refusal is usually explained as a practical matter. If he died without entering a plea, his property could not be legally confiscated by the court. His estate would pass to his heirs. But historian Chadwick Hansen has argued that much of Corey's property had already been seized, and that he had already made a will in prison. His death, Hansen suggests, was something else, a protest, a final act of defiance against the methods and the authority of a court he considered unjust. More weight. He was 81 years old. He lay in a field while stones crushed the life from him, and he never gave them what they wanted. 2 days later, on September 22nd, 8 more people were hanged in a single day. Mary Eastie, Martha Corey, Ann Putnam, Samuel Wardwell, Mary Parker, Alice Parker, Wilmot Red, and Margaret Scott. The Reverend Nicholas Noyes, watching the bodies, said, "What a sad thing it is to see 8 firebrands of hell hanging there." 8 firebrands of hell. 8 people who had maintained their innocence to the end, who had refused to confess to something they hadn't done, whose only crime was that someone had accused them. By the end of September, the executions had stopped, not because anyone in authority had had a sudden moral awakening, but because the logic of the situation had begun to fracture in ways that even the most committed participants couldn't ignore. It started, as it often does, with someone near the top. Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps, was accused. This was the moment when the machinery of accusation finally began to eat itself. When the wife of the most powerful man in the colony became a target, it suddenly became possible for powerful men to ask the question they had been afraid to ask before. What if the evidence isn't reliable? A group of ministers, led by the highly respected Increase Mather, had been quietly skeptical of spectral evidence since the trials began. In early October, Mather published a treatise titled Cases of Conscience. In it, he wrote words that would reverberate through the next generation of American legal thinking. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than 1 innocent person should be condemned. He was not saying witches didn't exist. He was not saying the devil wasn't at work. He was saying that the tools the court was using to identify witches were unreliable. That the devil could, in theory, send the specters of innocent people to afflict the accusers, and that therefore spectral testimony alone could not be trusted. It seems, from this distance, like an obvious point. But in the climate of Salem in 1692, saying it publicly took courage. On October 29, 1692, Governor Phipps dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer. The Superior Court of Judicature that replaced it did not allow spectral evidence. The first 5 cases it tried resulted in acquittals. Most of the remaining accused were acquitted. The rest were pardoned by Phipps in May 1693. The prisoners who couldn't pay their jail fees remained confined a little longer. The panic, after 9 months, was over, but it left behind a landscape. Imagine returning to Salem Village in the autumn of 1692, after the court has been dissolved and the executions have stopped. The harvest is in, or not in. Some of it went unattended while people were in jail or too frightened to leave their houses. Families are missing members. The Proctor household, where John has been hanged and Elizabeth was only spared because she was pregnant, has been stripped of most of its property. The court had seized it. Children are being raised by aunts and uncles and older siblings. Some people are returning from months in jail, thin and unwell, carrying the particular kind of damage that comes from being publicly accused of a capital crime. The village is physically the same houses along the same frozen lanes, the same church at its center, but everything that made it a community has been strained to a breaking point. Neighbor has testified against neighbor. Children have accused parents. Husbands have been separated from wives. The bonds of trust that allow people to live together, to let their children play at the neighbor's house, to share tools and seeds and labor, to lend money and know it'll be repaid, those bonds are frayed nearly to nothing. Samuel Parris, whose household was the origin of all of this, continued to serve as pastor for several more years, though more and more of his congregation abandoned him. He finally left Salem Village in 1697, replaced by a minister named Joseph Green, who immediately began the work of rebuilding what had been broken, reversing excommunications, reconciling factions, trying to make the community whole again. It would take a generation. The formal acknowledgments came slowly, in pieces, over years that stretched into decades, that stretched into centuries. On January 14th, 1697, less than 5 years after the hangings, Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting and soul-searching. It was a public acknowledgement that something had gone terribly wrong. On that same day, Samuel Sewall, one of the 9 judges who had served on the Court of Oyer and Terminer, stood up in the South Church in Boston during a worship service while a statement was read on his behalf. He acknowledged, in front of his congregation, blame and shame for his role in the trials. He was the only judge who ever publicly apologized. In 1702, the court declared the trials unlawful. In 1706, Ann Putnam Jr. did something that the other accusers never did. She stood before the Salem Village Church while a statement was read aloud. She was 27 now, the trials 14 years behind her. Her parents both dead, her 9 younger siblings dependent on her, and she offered a public apology. I desired to be humbled before God for that sad and humbling providence that befell my father's family in the year about 92. The statement read, that I, then being in my childhood, should, by such a providence of God, be made an instrument for the accusing of several people for grievous crimes, whereby their lives was taken away from them, whom now I have just grounds and good reason to believe they were innocent persons, and that it was a great delusion of Satan that deceived me in that sad time. She called herself an instrument. She asked for forgiveness from all those unto whom I have given just cause of sorrow and offense. She had accused 62 people. She was the only one who said she was sorry, Ann Putnam Jr., never married. She raised her siblings. She died in 1716 at 37 years old and was buried in an unmarked grave in Salem. In 1711, the colony passed legislation restoring the rights and good names of many of the accused, granting £600 in restitution to be divided among the heirs. Some families received compensation. Others, those whose relatives had died in prison before ever being convicted, or whose names had been left off the list for reasons no one fully understands, received nothing. The last formal exoneration came far later than anyone should be comfortable with. In 2022, 330 years after the hangings, Elizabeth Johnson Jr. of Andover, the final convicted Salem witch, whose name had not yet been officially cleared, was exonerated by the Massachusetts legislature. The campaign to clear her name was led by a class of 8th grade civics students, which tells you something about both the persistence of injustice and the particular power of young people who decide it matters. Now we arrive at the question that has haunted historians and scientists and psychologists and storytellers ever since. Why? Why did this happen? And here is where I want to be careful, because there is a temptation. When facing an event this dramatic, this concentrated, this definitively strange, to reach for a single clean explanation, to say it was the ergot in the rye, or it was the Putnam family's grudges, or it was the children lying for attention. A single cause, a clear villain, a satisfying conclusion. The truth resists that. In 1976, a behavioral psychologist named Linda Caporale published a paper in the journal Science that offered a compelling and genuinely interesting hypothesis. The afflicted girl's symptoms, the convulsions, the hallucinations, the visions, the burning sensations, were consistent with convulsive ergotism, a condition caused by ingesting grain contaminated with the fungus Claviceps purpurea, which grows on rye under conditions of cold winters, followed by wet springs. Ergot contains alkaloids closely related to lysergic acid, the same compound from which LSD is synthesized. People who consume large amounts of contaminated grain could experience vivid hallucinations, uncontrollable spasms, burning sensations in the skin, and altered mental states. Caporale noted that 1691 had been a cold winter followed by a wet spring, ideal conditions for ergot. She noted that rye was the staple grain of Salem. She noted that most of the afflicted girls lived on the western side of the village, near marshy ground where ergot might have concentrated. It was an elegant theory, and it spread widely through the popular imagination. Salem witch hunt, just a bad LSD trip, announced one national headline. But Salem historians largely refuted it, and their objections are serious. Ergotism typically afflicts whole households, not individuals. If the grain supply was contaminated, every member of a family who ate from it should have shown symptoms. That pattern didn't hold in Salem. Most of the symptoms reported in the trial records don't match what is documented in ergotism epidemics. There was no gangrene, no widespread physical deterioration, and the behaviors of the afflicted girls, observed carefully in the trial records, look more like social performance, the fits intensifying in front of audiences, accusations emerging in the courtroom itself, the pattern of affliction following the social fault lines of the community, than like medical poisoning. The ergot hypothesis is interesting. It might have played a small role, or no role at all, but it cannot, by itself, explain what happened in Salem. What explains it better, though still not completely because no single explanation can, is the convergence of multiple forces all pressing in the same direction at the same time. There was the social geography of Salem Village, the Putnam and Porter rivalry, the resentment of Salem town, the unresolved land disputes that ran through the community like cracks in old plaster. When accusations of witchcraft ran along those existing fault lines, it wasn't coincidence. It was the shape that fear takes when fear has a target already. There was the legal vacuum, a new charter, uncertain laws, a court created by emergency decree without established rules, presided over by a judge who accepted evidence that had no business being in any courtroom. There was the theological framework, a belief system in which invisible forces were always at work, in which the devil was as real as your neighbor, in which extraordinary suffering demanded a supernatural explanation. There was the political context, a community on the edge of a continent, recently traumatized by war and epidemic, and the loss of its legal charter, primed for the particular paranoia that comes from feeling besieged on all sides. There was the social dynamic of the accusers, a group of young women, mostly teenagers, living in a world where they had essentially no power, no future they could determine for themselves, no public role in the life of their community, and who found, in their afflictions, a form of influence they had never had before. Historian Carol Carlson has argued that some of the accusers, like Elizabeth Hubbard, who was an orphan domestic servant with no family or economic support, may have been expressing, through the performance of affliction, a genuine desperation that their society provided no other way to articulate. And there was the escalation mechanism built into the system itself. Confessing saved your life. Naming others accelerated the process of saving your life. The court's very structure rewarded the production of accusations and punished their refusal. Once enough people were confessing and naming names, the cascade became self-sustaining. These forces did not independently cause the Salem witch trials. They created the conditions in which a small ignition, sick children in a minister's house, a battered enslaved woman forced into confession, could generate a fire large enough to consume 25 lives and devastate hundreds more. There is no single villain here. That is one of the most unsettling things about this story. Stoughton was a true believer. The Putnams, on some level, almost certainly believed they were fighting genuine evil. The afflicted girls were, by any reasonable assessment, a mix of genuinely frightened young people, socially desperate young people, and some who were willing to extend accusations further than their experience required. Samuel Parris was a man protecting his position. The community was a group of frightened, exhausted, traumatized people trying to make sense of forces they didn't have the tools to understand. There is no cartoon devil. There are only people, and fear, and a legal system that failed them, and a theology that closed off certain paths of questioning, and bad luck, and old grudges, and the terrible way that ordinary human mechanisms, the need for explanation, the desire for safety, the impulse to belong to something, can combine into something that leaves 25 people dead. There is one more thing, and I want to end there because it is perhaps the most important thing. The Salem witch trials did not produce a lasting immunity. In 1953, playwright Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible. He had been to Salem. He had sat in the old courthouse and read the transcripts of the trials. And what he saw there, he also saw happening in the present. Not witches, but the Senate hearings and House investigations that were destroying careers and lives based on association, rumor, and political fear. McCarthyism, the Red Scare. The same mechanism 300 years later. The accusation that can't be disproven. The evidence that is whatever the accusers say it is. The survival strategy that involves naming others. The community that rewards fear and punishes doubt. Miller's point was not that the 1950s were exactly like 1692. His point was that the mechanism was the same. That a society under pressure will find its outlets. That the invisible threats, communism, witchcraft, whatever the fear of the moment names as the enemy within, serve specific functions. They give form to diffuse anxiety. They identify a target. They allow communities to externalize their internal fractures. We have done this before. We will do it again. The question is whether we recognize it. What happened in Salem was not a story about ignorant people in a primitive time believing in impossible things. It was a story about what happens when fear overwhelms the structures designed to contain it. When courts stop asking for evidence. When communities stop protecting the accused. When the pressure to name names becomes more powerful than the obligation to tell the truth. The spectral evidence, the dream testimony, the vision testimony, the I saw your shape in my sleep and it hurt me testimony was accepted not because people were stupid, but because they were frightened, and the law had collapsed, and no one with enough power was willing to say, "This is not enough. This is not enough." 3 words that might have saved 25 lives. Wherever you are tonight, whatever the darkness is pressing against your window glass, I hope you carry something of this story with you. Not as a horror story, though it is terrible enough to be one, but as a study in attention, in the importance of asking, quietly and persistently, even when it's uncomfortable, is this enough? Is this evidence? Are we sure? The people of Salem were not so different from us. They had the same fears, the same needs, the same capacity for both cruelty and courage. Rebecca Nurse standing in a courtroom at 71, maintaining her innocence when almost everyone around her had capitulated. Giles Corey in a field, under the weight of stones, choosing dignity over survival. Samuel Sewall standing in church, saying blame and shame. They did not all do the right thing. Some of them did it terribly wrong, with real consequences for real people. But among the villagers of Salem in 1692, there were also those who resisted, who petitioned, who questioned, who stood up to say, this has gone too far. It should also remember the courage, now that the images of that cold Massachusetts winter begin to blur and soften. The bare trees, the frozen lanes, the house where 2 children fell ill, and the world changed. Let it recede. Let it settle somewhere quiet, to be turned over and thought about when you're ready. You did something thoughtful tonight. You chose to understand rather than simply be frightened. That matters. If this kind of storytelling settles well with you, if this is the kind of company you like to keep as you drift off to sleep, please consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing to History to Unwind. It's a small gesture, but it genuinely helps us keep doing what we do, and it means more than we can say. Sleep well, and remember, the scariest stories are often the ones we tell ourselves.